I let my family rely on me for years without question. But one day I decided enough was enough and ended the cycle completely. They looked at my weathered coat and saw a man with nothing left to give, a relic of a bygone era who had outlived his usefulness. They saw the fraying cuffs of a jacket I had owned for 30 years and the scuffed leather of shoes that had walked 1,000 miles of history. And they assumed my pockets were as empty as they believed my mind to be. They didn't realize, as they sat there sipping their overpriced vintage wines and checking their gleaming watches, that I was the only reason they had anything at all. It is a peculiar thing, my friends, how the world begins to treat you like a ghost before you've even had the decency to die. They look right through you, or worse. They look down upon you with a pity that smells like condescension. But what they forgot, what my own blood and bone forgot, is that a foundation is always buried underground, out of sight, and covered in dirt. It isn't pretty. It isn't flashy. But without it, the whole damn house comes crashing down. And that night, in the heart of a rain-slicked Vienna, I decided it was finally time to see how well they could fly without the ground beneath their feet. The rain was the kind of cold that bites through to the marrow. The sort of evening where the cobblestones of the Innere Stadt shine like polished obsidian under the street lamps. I stood outside the Gilded Heron, a restaurant so exclusive that the menu doesn't even bother with prices, and the staff are trained to smell a bank balance from 50 paces. I adjusted my Loden coat, a gift from my late Martha on our 25th anniversary, and felt the familiar weight of the world on my shoulders. I wasn't there for the food. I was there because my son, Thomas, and my daughter, Claire, had summoned me for what they called a family summit. Usually, those words were just a polite euphemism, for we need more money, or we've made another mess for you to clean up. As I reached for the heavy brass handle of the door, a young man in a tuxedo, barely old enough to shave, stepped in my path. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my damp hat and the way my trousers were a bit baggier than the modern fashion dictates. His lip curled in a way that suggested he'd just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "I'm sorry, sir, but we are fully committed this evening," the boy said, his voice dripping with a fake politeness that was thinner than the soup they likely served. He didn't move an inch, his body forming a barrier between me and the warmth radiating from the foyer. I looked him in the eye, seeing the arrogance of youth and the blindness of status. I could have told him then. I could have mentioned that I remember when this building was a crumbling warehouse, and that I was the one who signed the development grants that turned this entire district into a gold mine, but I simply nodded, my voice steady and low. "I am meeting the Von Houtens," I replied. The name seemed to register, not because of me, but because my children had spent the last decade building a reputation for spending money they hadn't earned. The waiter's eyes flickered with doubt, a silent battle raging between his desire to kick out a pensioner and his fear of offending a high-paying table. Finally, with a sigh that was intentionally audible, he stepped aside and gestured toward the back, near the kitchen doors, the Siberia of fine dining. As I walked through the dining room, the hush of silver against porcelain seemed to falter. I felt the stares of the elite, the subtle shifts in posture, as people pulled their designer handbags a little closer to their chairs. To them, I was a smudge on a masterpiece, a reminder of the working class that they preferred to keep in the history books. I saw Thomas and Claire before they saw me. They were huddled together, glowing in the light of their smartphones, looking every bit the successful Europeans they pretended to be. Thomas was in a slim-fit Italian suit that cost more than my first car, and Claire was draped in silk, her jewelry catching the candlelight with a predatory glint. They looked like they belonged here. They looked like the future. But as I approached, I saw the lines of stress around Thomas's eyes and the way Claire's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. The facade was expensive, but it was cracking. "Father, you're late," Thomas said without looking up, his tone clipped and impatient. He didn't offer a chair or a greeting. He simply checked his watch as if my presence were a scheduled inconvenience. Claire finally looked at me, but instead of a smile, her face contorted into a mask of embarrassment. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the soft jazz playing in the background. "Dad, honestly, did you have to wear that coat? People are staring. You look like you've come to fix the plumbing." I pulled out my own chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and sat down. I placed my damp hat on the empty chair beside me, ignoring the waiter who scurried over to move it as if it were contaminated. "It's a good coat, Claire," I said quietly. "It keeps the cold out," which is more than I can say for this conversation so far. I looked at them both, my children, whom I had raised with every ounce of love and every cent of profit from the family estate. I had bailed Thomas out of 3 failed tech startups and paid off Claire's gambling debts in London under the guise of boutique investments. I had been their silent partner, their safety net, and their ATM for 20 years. The waiter returned, not to take my order, but to place the glass bottle of mineral water on the table. The cheapest thing on the menu without being asked. He didn't even offer me a glass. Thomas didn't notice. He was too busy laying out a series of legal documents on the white linen tablecloth, pushing aside the breadbasket as if it were an obstacle. "Look, Father, we don't have much time," Thomas began, his voice taking on that condescending business tone he used when he wanted something. "The estate in Salzburg. The old manor. It's a drain on resources. The maintenance costs are astronomical. And frankly, it's a waste of prime real estate. Claire and I have been talking to some developers from Dubai. They want to turn the grounds into a luxury wellness retreat. It's a win-win. You get a nice, modern apartment in the city with a lift and a medical alert system, and we finally get some liquidity to grow our own ventures." He pushed a pen toward me, his eyes gleaming with the desperate hunger of a man who owes money to people who don't take no for an answer. I looked down at the documents. They were seeking my signature, to sign over the deed to the ancestral home, the house where their mother had breathed her last, the land that had been in our family since the days of the Empire. It wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary of memory, a piece of European soul that couldn't be quantified in euros. "The roof needs mending, Thomas," I said, my voice barely above a murmur. "And the gardens? The roses your mother planted are finally starting to climb the east wall." Claire rolled her eyes, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a physical blow. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Dad. Stop being so sentimental. The house is a tomb. You're rattling around in there like a ghost. And for what? To honor a past that doesn't exist anymore. We're living in the real world. We have overheads. We have reputations. We can't be tied down by a crumbling pile of stones just because you're too stubborn to move on." She took a long sip of her wine, her eyes cold and calculating, seeing her own father as nothing more than a legal hurdle to be cleared. I leaned back, feeling the coldness of the restaurant seep into my bones. For years, I had told myself that their selfishness was just a phase, a symptom of the modern age, or perhaps a failure of my own parenting. I had kept the truth of our family's wealth a secret, wanting them to build something of their own, to know the value of a hard day's work. I had lived simply, dressed humbly, and acted as the boring patriarch so they could have the spotlight. But sitting there, watching them carve up my life before I was even in the ground, I realized that I hadn't been protecting them. I had been enabling them. I had turned them into vultures who didn't even have the patience to wait for the heart to stop beating. The waiter returned then, leaning over to whisper to Thomas, "Sir, I'm afraid we'll need the table in 20 minutes for a VIP reservation. Perhaps you could settle the bill for the appetizers now." He pointedly ignored me, his gaze lingering on the documents as if he knew exactly what was happening. He saw an old man being put out to pasture, and he was eager to help clear the stable. "Don't worry about the bill," Thomas snapped at the waiter, though his hand went instinctively to his jacket pocket, where I knew his credit card was currently over its limit. He turned back to me, his face reddening with a mix of shame and anger. "Just sign the papers. Dad, don't make this difficult. You've always said you wanted what's best for us. Well, this is it. Unless, of course, you want to see your son go bankrupt and your daughter lose her standing in the community. Is that what you want? To be the old man who ruined his children's future because he liked a view of the mountains." The cruelty in his voice was a sharp contrast to the soft, golden light of the chandeliers. I looked at the pen, a cheap plastic thing Claire had pulled from her purse, and then I looked at their faces. There was no love there. There wasn't even respect. There was only the cold, hard math of greed. They thought they were the masters of the universe, and I was just the janitor holding the keys. It's funny, isn't it? How we spend our lives building walls to keep our loved ones safe, only to realize the walls have become a prison for ourselves. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent in the library of that crumbling house, managing the diversified portfolios, the shipping lanes, and the heritage trusts that funded their every whim. I thought about the phone calls I took at 3 in the morning to stop the banks from seizing Thomas's assets, all while letting him believe he'd negotiated his way out of trouble. They saw a man who couldn't figure out a smartphone. They didn't see the man who owned the infrastructure the phone ran on. The waiter hovered nearby, checking his watch again, his presence a silent insult. The entire room felt like it was closing in, a theater of the absurd where the actors had forgotten who wrote the play. "You really think I'm just a burden, don't you?" I asked, my voice calm, almost curious. Claire didn't even blink. "We don't think you're a burden, Dad. We just think you're irrelevant. The world has changed. You're still living in the 20th century, and we're trying to survive in the 21st. It's time to let go, sign the papers, and let us handle the heavy lifting. You can spend your days in a nice facility with people your own age. You'll be much happier." She reached out and patted my hand, a gesture so condescending, it made my skin crawl. It was the touch of someone comforting a child or a pet that was about to be put down. I felt a slow, cold fire begin to burn in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the feeling of a man who had finally reached the end of his patience. I looked at the documents one last time. They had even gone so far as to include a clause that would prevent me from speaking to the press or contesting the sale in the future. They had thought of everything except the man sitting across from them. I picked up the pen, and for a moment, the hope in their eyes was disgusting. They leaned forward, their breath held, waiting for the stroke of ink that would finalize their betrayal. But instead of signing, I began to draw a slow, deliberate line through every single page. I crossed out the names, the figures, and the legal jargon. I did it slowly, making sure the ink tore into the paper. A physical manifestation of the bridge I was about to burn. "What are you doing?" Thomas hissed, reaching out to grab the papers. But I held them down with a strength that clearly surprised him. My hands might be old, but they are not weak. I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in his life, he saw the man. I actually am not the father he wanted to ignore, but the force of nature he should have feared. I am ending the cycle. "Thomas," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the sudden silence of our corner. "You want to talk about the real world. You want to talk about liquidity and relevance. Very well. Let's talk about the real world." The waiter stepped forward, his face twisted in annoyance. "Sir, I must insist you leave if you aren't going to." I didn't even look at him. I simply raised a hand. And something in my posture made him stop dead in his tracks. The air in the room seemed to shift, the weight of authority finally making itself known. "I'm not finished yet," I told the room, and for once, everyone was listening. "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step," they say, "but the journey of 1,000 regrets begins with a single act of greed." My children sat there, stunned, watching as I ruined their perfect plan with a few strokes of a cheap pen. They didn't know that part one of this evening was just the introduction. They didn't know that the man in the weathered coat was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to sell the ground you're standing on. The rain continued to lash against the windows of the Gilded Heron, but inside, the atmosphere had turned far colder than the storm outside. This was the moment the pillar began to wake up, and the house of cards they had built was starting to tremble. Thomas's face went from a pale, calculating white to a deep, bruised purple. In a matter of seconds, for a moment, the only sound was the muffled roar of the Vienna traffic outside and the delicate clinking of crystal from the tables of people who actually mattered, or so they thought. My son reached across the table, his fingers trembling with a mix of rage and genuine terror, trying to salvage the ruined documents. "Have you lost your mind?" he hissed, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That was our exit strategy. That was the bridge to the future." He looked at the black ink bleeding into the expensive paper as if I had just spilled the blood of his firstborn. Claire was no better. She let out a sharp, jagged laugh of disbelief, her eyes darting around the room to see if anyone had witnessed her father's senile outburst. She didn't see a man standing up for his dignity. She saw a PR nightmare in a loaden coat. "I know exactly what I've done, Thomas," I said, leaning back as the waiter finally made his move. He didn't just walk over. He descended upon us like a vulture that had spotted a dying animal. He placed a hand on the back of my chair, a violation of the very etiquette this place pretended to uphold. "Sir, I think it's time you left," he said, his voice no longer hiding behind the mask of service. "You are clearly distressed, and you are disturbing our guests. We cannot have scenes in a premier establishment like this." He looked at Thomas and Claire with a sympathetic tilt of the head, as if apologizing on behalf of the universe for the burden of having me as a father. It was a masterclass in subtle cruelty, the kind of European elitism that doesn't need to shout to make you feel like dirt beneath a boot. I looked up at the waiter, a man who probably spent his entire paycheck on hair gel and ironed shirts just to feel superior to the people he served. "Distressed? No. Young man, I am the calmest person in this room," I replied, my voice holding a resonance that seemed to vibrate the water in the glasses. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply sat there, a rock in the middle of their shallow stream. But my children weren't finished. Seeing the waiter as an ally, Claire leaned forward, her voice dripping with a poison she had been brewing for years. "He's not well. Marcus," she said to the waiter, using his name as if they were old friends. "He's been confused lately. The estate. It's too much for him. We were just trying to help him transition into a more managed lifestyle. Perhaps you could help him to a taxi. We'll settle the bill for the disruption." The managed lifestyle? Those were the words they used for a warehouse for the elderly, a place where they could park me and forget me while they liquidated the history of our family. I watched them, and for a moment, the restaurant faded away. I was back in the winter of 1984, standing in a freezing warehouse in Rotterdam. working 18-hour shifts to ensure the Von Houten shipping line didn't go under during the recession. I remembered the blisters on my hands and the way my back ached as I hauled crates because I couldn't afford the extra staff. I did it for them. I did it so Thomas could go to the best boarding schools in Switzerland, and so Claire could have the horses and the dresses and the life of a princess. I had built a mountain of gold for them to stand on, and their first instinct was to use that height to look down on me. A managed lifestyle, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat. Thomas flinched, perhaps thinking I was going to pull out a weapon or another legal document. Instead, I pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was old, the edges curled and the spine held together by tape. I opened it to a page near the back. Thomas, on the 14th of last month, you took out a short-term loan from a private equity firm in Frankfurt. The interest rate is predatory, and the collateral is the Salzburg Manor, which, I might remind you, you don't actually own yet. Thomas went deathly still. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. And Claire, I continued, turning a page, your boutique investment in the London Art Gallery. It wasn't an investment. It was a cover for the six-figure debt you owe to a casino in Mayfair. You've been using the family name to buy time, haven't you? The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The waiter, Marcus, shifted uncomfortably. He was realizing that the confused old man had a sharper bite than the successful children. Claire's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. How do you know that? She whispered. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I had spent 40 years being the smartest man in the room by letting everyone else think I was the dullest. I had watched their bank accounts, their shell companies, and their increasingly desperate maneuvers with the patient eye of a hawk. I had given them enough rope to hang themselves, and they had skipped right to the gallows. You've been spying on us. Thomas finally found his voice, though it was high-pitched and defensive. That's a violation of privacy. You're proving our point. Father, you're paranoid. You're unstable. Marcus, please, call security. This is getting out of hand. The waiter hesitated, his eyes darting toward the front of the restaurant, where the floor manager was already watching us with a furrowed brow. The tension was at a breaking point. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons on us, the judgment, the amusement, the cold curiosity of the upper class. Watching a family shred itself apart over appetizers. It was exactly the kind of spectacle my children dreaded. Yet they were the ones who had staged the play. Security won't be necessary. A new voice joined the table. It was the floor manager, a man named Henri, who had been running the Gilded Heron for 20 years. He was the epitome of Viennese sophistication: silver hair, a suit that fit like a second skin, and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. He looked at the ruined papers, then at the agitated Thomas, and finally, at me. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in my loaden coat and my weathered face. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, not the contempt of the waiter, but a sudden, sharp realization. It was the look of a man who had just seen a ghost he recognized from a very expensive portrait. Is there a problem here, Monsieur? Henri asked, his voice smooth as silk. Before I could speak, Thomas chimed in, his desperation reaching a fever pitch. Yes, Henri, there's a huge problem. My father is having some sort of breakdown. He's being disruptive and making wild accusations. We need to get him out of here quietly before he ruins the evening for everyone. Please, just get him a car and send the bill to my office. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a credit card, a gold one. Flashy, but ultimately meaningless in the circles we moved in. He held it out like a shield, a symbol of the power he thought he had. Henri didn't look at the card. He didn't even acknowledge Thomas's existence. He was still looking at me, his posture subtly shifting from an authoritative stance to something almost deferential. I see, Henri murmured. He turned his gaze to the waiter, Marcus, who was still standing there like a sentry. Marcus, go to the kitchen and bring a bottle of the 82 Reserve. And bring the proper crystal, not these. He gestured dismissively at the glasses on our table. The waiter gasped. But sir, that bottle is reserved for the owner's private cellar. We aren't authorized to. Henri cut him off with a single look. I said, go. Now, Thomas and Claire were baffled. The 82 Reserve. Henri, what are you talking about? Claire asked, her voice trembling. We're leaving. We don't need expensive wine. We need this man removed. She pointed a manicured finger at me. Her face contorted in a sneer that stripped away every ounce of the beauty she spent so much money to maintain. I felt a wave of profound sadness for her. She had been given everything and had learned the value of nothing. She looked at me and saw an obstacle. She didn't see the man who used to carry her on his shoulders through the pine forests of the Alps, telling her stories of the stars. That man was dead to them, buried under a pile of debt and vanity. I reached out and picked up the water bottle the waiter had dumped on the table earlier. I poured a small amount into the cheap glass, the liquid clear and cold. You know, children, I said, my voice cutting through their confusion. There is a certain beauty in simplicity. A house is just wood and stone. A coat is just wool. But a name is a promise. And you have broken every promise you ever made to this family. I took a sip of the water. Looking at them over the rim of the glass, I could see the gears turning in their heads. The sudden, terrifying suspicion that they had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. They looked at Henri, who was now standing with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for my next move. "Father, what is going on?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was looking at the way Henri was treating me. In the world of high-end service, there is a specific language of movement, the way a person stands, the distance they keep, the tone of their voice. Henri was treating me like royalty, and my children, despite all their pretensions, were being treated like background noise. The air in the Gilded Heron seemed to grow thinner. The plot twist was hovering in the air, a dark cloud ready to burst. And for the first time that night, the smugness on their faces was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They had come here to strip me of my legacy, never realizing that I was the one who controlled the very air they breathed. "You wanted to talk about the real world, Thomas," I said, setting the glass down with a soft thud. "You wanted to talk about who has the power and who is irrelevant. Well, the real world is a very small place when you owe money to the wrong people. And it's an even smaller place when the man you're trying to rob is the one who holds the lease on your life." I looked at Henri and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The floor manager bowed a deep, respectful bow that sent a shockwave of silence through the nearby tables. The waiter returned with the 82 Reserve, his hands shaking so much the bottle clinked against the silver tray. The stage was set. The tension was at its zenith, and the mask of the poor old man was about to fall away for good. The silence that followed Henri's bow was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a sudden drop in pressure that made the ears pop and the heart skip a beat. The waiter, Marcus, stood frozen, the silver tray in his hands rattling like a snare drum in a storm. My children, Thomas and Claire, looked at the manager as if he had suddenly started speaking a forgotten ancient tongue. The poor old man they had come to bury was being treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heads of state or the titans of industry whose names are carved into the very stone of the city. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice was a strangled croak, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, blinking confusion. He looked from Henri to me, then back to the manager, his mind desperately trying to find a logical explanation that didn't involve his world turning upside down. "Henri," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "The 82 is a bit much for a Wednesday, don't you think? But then again, it's not every day one witnesses the death of a delusion." I didn't look at my children yet. I watched Marcus, the waiter. His face had turned a shade of gray that matched the overcast Vienna sky. He realized, with the slow-motion horror of a man falling from a great height, that the person he had tried to humiliate was the very person who signed his paychecks. I saw the beads of sweat forming on his brow, the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the tray. This was the moment of the twist. My friends, the moment when the mask of the victim falls away to reveal the master of the house. Just then, the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Heron swung open again. A man in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Thomas's car, marched straight toward our table. This wasn't a waiter or a manager. This was Dr. Klaus Steiner, the most feared corporate attorney in Central Europe and my personal counsel for 30 years. He didn't look at the decor, and he didn't look at the patrons. He stopped at our table, ignored the children entirely, and bowed deeply. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman," Steiner said, his voice echoing in the hush. "I have the finalized acquisition papers you requested. The debt purchase for the Von Houten subsidiaries was completed at 4:30 this afternoon. You are now the sole primary creditor for every entity under your children's names." The air seemed to leave the room. Claire let out a small, pathetic whimper, her hand flying to her throat, as if she were choking on her own silk scarf. Thomas sat back in his chair, his body suddenly limp, his eyes wide and vacant. The exit strategy he had been so proud of, the plan to sell the family estate, wasn't just ruined, it was irrelevant. He didn't just owe money to banks anymore. He owed it to me. Every loan, every credit line, every leveraged asset they had used to fund their vanity had been quietly bought up by the man they called irrelevant. I reached out and took the 82 Reserve from the trembling waiter, pouring a glass myself since Marcus seemed to have lost the use of his limbs. "You see, Thomas," I began, the wine glowing like liquid rubies in the candlelight. The world hasn't changed as much as you think. It still runs on character, on legacy, and on the simple fact that you should never underestimate the man who built the road you're walking on. You thought I was a ghost. No, I was the architect. I let you play at being successful because I hoped you would eventually learn the weight of responsibility. But instead, you learned only the weight of your own greed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It was magnificent complex, aged to perfection, and possessing a finish that lingered like a long-forgotten memory. Claire found her voice, though it was high and hysterical. You bought our debt. Why? To control us. To keep us under your thumb in that rotting house in Salzburg. She was still trying to fight, still trying to make me the villain of her story. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt no anger, only a profound sense of closure. I bought your debt to protect the family name from your incompetence, Claire. And as for the house, it isn't rotting. It is being restored. It will be a foundation for those who actually value our heritage. Not a fire sale for your next shopping trip to London. I turned to Steiner. Klaus, please inform my children of the new terms of their managed lifestyle. Steiner opened his briefcase with a clinical snap. As of this moment, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, all corporate accounts tied to Thomas and Claire von Houten have been frozen pending a full audit. The luxury vehicles, the apartments in Vienna and London, and the expense accounts are all technically assets of the von Houten Heritage Trust. Since the trust is under the sole discretion of the chairman, those assets are being reclaimed. You will be provided with a modest monthly stipend, provided you relocate to the estate and participate in its upkeep. Under your father's supervision, of course, the irony was delicious. But the justice was even better. They had come to force me into a managed facility, and now they were the ones being sent to the very house they despised, to work the very land they had tried to sell. Thomas looked like he wanted to scream, but he was looking at Henri, who was now standing with a security team at a discreet distance. The manager wasn't there to protect my children from me. He was there to ensure they didn't cause a scene in my restaurant. That was the final blow. The realization that this entire establishment, the very stage they had chosen for my humiliation, was part of my portfolio. Wait, Thomas stammered, his eyes darting to the curious onlookers at the other tables. You own this place. You own the Gilded Heron. I smiled. A small, tired smile. I own the building, the brand, and the ground it sits on. Thomas, I bought it 20 years ago because your mother liked the view of the canal from this corner window. I kept it because it reminded me of her. It's a shame you never bothered to ask why we always had the best table. Even when I wore my plumbing coat, I turned my attention to Marcus, the waiter, who looked as if he were about to faint. And as for you, young man, I said, my tone softening but remaining firm. Hospitality is not about the clothes a man wears. It is about the dignity you afford him. You failed that test tonight. Henri will discuss your future employment or lack thereof in the morning. Marcus bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the table, whispering apologies that fell on deaf ears. I wasn't interested in his penance. I was interested in the lesson. I looked back at my children. They looked small. For all their expensive suits and designer labels, they looked like frightened children who had been caught stealing from the cookie jar. The power they thought they had was a shadow, a temporary gift from a father they had tried to discard like a piece of old furniture. The dinner is over, I said, standing up. I didn't feel the weight on my shoulders anymore. The coldness of the rain outside no longer seemed threatening. It felt like a cleansing. I picked up my loading coat. The coat, Claire said, looked like a plumber's and draped it over my arm. Klaus will handle the details. I suggest you go home and start packing. The Salzburg air is very brisk this time of year. It's good for the soul. It forces you to move, to work, to stay warm by your own efforts, rather than the heat of someone else's fire. As I walked toward the exit, the entire restaurant seemed to exhale. The patrons who had looked at me with disdain now averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their steaks. Henri walked beside me, opening the heavy doors with a flourish. A car is waiting for you. Monsieur von Houten, he said quietly. I thanked him and stepped out into the night. The rain was still falling, but the air felt fresh. I looked back through the window one last time. Thomas and Claire were still sitting there, frozen in the golden light. Two statues of greed in a temple they no longer controlled. They had thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. They had thought the world belonged to the young, the fast, and the flashy, but they forgot that the old lion doesn't need to roar to prove he is the king. He only needs to wake up. As I climbed into the back of the car, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in decades. The cycle was broken. The truth was out. And for the first time in a long time, the name von Houten meant something more than just a balance sheet. It meant a legacy that was finally, truly, in safe hands. The car door closed with a soft, heavy thud, sealing out the sound of the rain and the judgmental whispers of the gilded heron. As the Mercedes glided silently away from the curb, I watched the reflection of the restaurant's golden lights ripple and fade in the window glass. It felt as though I had just stepped out of a fever dream, one that had lasted for 20 years. For 2 decades, I had carried the burden of being the simple father, the outdated relic, all to keep the peace and provide a cushion for children who had forgotten how to walk on their own 2 feet. But sitting in the back seat now, the leather cool against my hands, I realized that the silence wasn't empty. It was full of a newfound freedom. I looked at my hands, the hands that had worked the docks, signed the million-dollar contracts, and held my children as babies. They were steady now. The tremor of anxiety that had plagued me for years, the fear of what will they think, or how will they pay for this, had vanished. I was no longer a safety net. I was the captain of my own ship. Once again. Behind me, in that temple of high-end dining, I knew the chaos was just beginning. Thomas would be frantically calling his bankers, only to find that every line of credit had been severed with surgical precision. Claire would be scrolling through her contacts, trying to find anyone who still saw her as a socialite rather than a liability. And Marcus, the young waiter who thought a tuxedo gave him the right to look down on a Loden coat, would be learning that the most important people are often the ones who don't feel the need to prove it. It wasn't about revenge, though I'll admit there was a certain sweetness to the justice. It was about restoration. You see, my friends, when you allow people to treat you poorly because you love them, you aren't just hurting yourself. You are robbing them of the chance to be better people. By shielding my children from the consequences of their arrogance, I had stunted their souls. That night, I finally gave them the gift of reality. The following morning, the sun broke over the Salzburg peaks, casting a sharp, clean light over the von Houten estate. I stood on the stone terrace, a cup of strong, black coffee in my hand, watching the mist rise from the valley floor. The house didn't look like a crumbling tomb to me. It looked like a witness. It had seen the wars, the rebuilding of Europe, the birth of my children, and the passing of my beloved Martha. It was a place of character, where every creak in the floorboards told a story of resilience. I had already spent the early hours on the phone with the groundskeepers and the restoration team. We weren't going to build a wellness retreat for the bored elite. We were going to restore the library, fix the roof, and bring the orchards back to life. This house was going to be a home again, not a commodity. And the best part was that I wouldn't be doing it alone. Around noon, a dusty rental car, the cheapest model available, no doubt trudged up the long, winding driveway. I watched from the terrace as Thomas and Claire stepped out. Gone were the designer suits and the silk scarves. They were dressed in whatever they could scramble together from the few bags they were allowed to keep. They looked tired, humbled, and more than a little frightened. They looked at the massive stone facade of the manor, not with the eyes of developers looking for profit, but with the eyes of exiles returning to the only place that would still have them. They walked up the steps slowly, their footsteps heavy on the stone. I didn't go down to meet them. I waited for them to come to me. It was time for a new set of rules in the house of von Houten. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice lacking the sharp, corporate edge it had held the night before. "Father," he began, looking at his scuffed shoes. We didn't realize. We were told by the lawyers that if we didn't settle the debts by the end of the month, they would come for everything. We were desperate. We thought selling the house was the only way to save the family name. It was a lie, or at least a half-truth, but I let it hang in the air for a moment. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the genuine fear of a man who had realized that his father wasn't just a bank, but the actual foundation of his life. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth of the ceramic comforting in the crisp mountain air. The family name is not a brand to be traded. "Thomas," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the terrace, "it is a responsibility. You were willing to sell our history to pay for your mistakes. That is not survival. That is betrayal." Claire stepped forward then, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying the whole way from Vienna. "What happens now?" "Dad, we have nothing. The bank froze my cards this morning. They took the car. I don't even have enough for a hotel." She looked at me with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since she was 10 years old. In that moment, the anger I felt toward them softened into a stern, fatherly resolve. They were broken, and while I wouldn't fix them with money, I would help them rebuild with work. I led them inside, to the great hall, where the portraits of our ancestors hung. I pointed to the painting of my grandfather, a man who had started with a single barge on the Danube and built an empire. He didn't build this by looking down on people. I told them, he built it by being the first one on the docks and the last one to leave. He knew the name of every man who worked for him. He wore the same coat for 20 years because he preferred to invest in his people rather than his wardrobe. I turned back to my children. "You will live in the West Wing. You will receive a stipend that covers the basics: food, modest clothing, and transportation. In exchange, you will work. Thomas, you will work with the estate manager on the books and the physical restoration of the outbuildings. Claire, you will manage the gardens and the archives. You will learn the history of the things you were so eager to destroy. The look of shock on their faces was almost comical, but they didn't argue. They couldn't. They were standing in the middle of a reality they had tried to avoid for decades. Over the next few months, something remarkable began to happen. The arrogance started to flake away like old paint. I watched Thomas, his hands blistered and dirty, as he helped the carpenters repair the beams in the old barn. I saw him talking to the local workmen, not as a superior, but as a student. And Claire found a peace she had never known in the frantic social circles of London. She spent her days in the library, cataloging letters that dated back to the 1800s. Discovering that her ancestors were much more than just names on a deed, she stopped checking her phone every 5 minutes and started noticing the way the light hit the mountains at sunset. As for me, I reclaimed the pieces of myself I had tucked away. I wore my Loden coat with pride, walking the grounds every morning, feeling the connection to the land and the past. I realized that my wealth wasn't in the stocks Steiner managed or the real estate I owned. It was in the character of the life I chose to lead. I started a foundation for local artisans, ensuring that the traditional crafts of our region wouldn't be lost to the march of modernity. I didn't need the validation of a fancy restaurant or the fawning of a waiter like Marcus. I had the respect of the people who mattered, and more importantly, I finally had the respect of my own children, not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. One evening, as we sat around the heavy oak table in the dining room, the same table where they had once tried to plot my retirement, Thomas looked up from his plate. "You know, Father," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I spent so long trying to be someone that I forgot how to just be a man. I'm sorry. For everything." Claire nodded in agreement, her face devoid of the heavy makeup she used to wear like armor. I looked at them and felt a sense of completion. The cycle of greed and entitlement had been broken. It had taken a shocking revelation and a sweet revenge, but it had led us to a place of truth. We were a family again, bound not by debt or obligation, but by a shared understanding of what it means to be a Von Houten. To those of you listening, especially those of you who have spent your lives building something only to feel overlooked by the very people you built it for, remember this: your value is not determined by the way others see you, but by the strength of your own heart. Don't be afraid to set boundaries. Don't be afraid to let the people you love face the consequences of their actions. It is the hardest thing a parent or a friend can do, but it is often the only way to save them. A coat can be old, a car can be weathered, and a man can be quiet. But that doesn't mean the fire has gone out. Sometimes, you have to let the world think you're a ghost just so you can show them what it looks like when a legend wakes up. I hope this story has touched something in you today. If it has, I'd love for you to join our community. Please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next journey together. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that their worth is more than their appearance. And remember, the most powerful person in the room is often the one who doesn't feel the need to say a word. Until next time, my friends, keep your heart open, your boundaries firm, and your head held high. This is Arthur von Houten, and I'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. Thank you for following this journey. If you enjoyed the story, please support the channel and share the wisdom.